The unseen storm. Marcus Hayes had always been a man of the kitchen, his hands sculpting flavors and crafting masterpieces from the simplest of ingredients. For years, he had been the heart and soul of Au Grand Epicurean, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of a bustling city. The kitchen was his sanctuary, a place where the clang of pots and the hum of ovens were like music to his ears. It was where he felt truly alive. His hands, dark and steady, moved with a practiced rhythm as he chopped fresh thyme, basil, and rosemary, the aromatic herbs filling the air with their enticing scent. The heat from the stove seemed to wrap around him like a warm embrace as he sauteed vegetables in a sizzling pan. Each movement was fluid, each dish more than just food. It was art. The kitchen at Au Grand Epicurean was a well-oiled machine, and Marcus had been a vital cog in it for nearly a decade. His talents were widely respected, not just among his peers, but also by the restaurant's elite clientele. The dishes that left his station were nothing short of extraordinary, each one the perfect balance of flavor, texture, and innovation. It was no surprise that the restaurant had garnered critical acclaim over the years, earning Michelin stars and a loyal following of food enthusiasts. Marcus, however, was humble. He never sought the spotlight, preferring to let his food speak for itself. But on one fateful morning, something changed. A shift was coming, one that would rock the foundation of everything Marcus had worked so hard for. It began with the arrival of a new head chef, someone who was heralded as a rising star in the culinary world. His name was Antonio Leclerc, a man known for his avant-garde approach to cuisine and his brash, no-nonsense attitude. Antonio had worked in some of the finest kitchens in Paris, London, and New York before taking the job at Au Grand Epicurean. He was young, ambitious, and eager to make his mark on the restaurant's already stellar reputation. From the moment Antonio stepped into the kitchen, there was an unspoken tension. Marcus could feel it in the air, the way the new chef's eyes seemed to scan him, sizing him up as if he were an unknown variable in the equation. Antonio wasn't the type to introduce himself with pleasantries or open conversation. Instead, he dove straight into the kitchen, barking orders at the staff with an almost brutal efficiency. His approach was radically different from Marcus's, and it was clear that Antonio had a vision for the restaurant that did not align with the legacy Marcus had helped to build. At first, Marcus tried to adapt. He knew how to work with new chefs. Every kitchen had its own rhythm, its own quirks. But something about Antonio's methods grated on him. There was no room for collaboration in Antonio's world, only strict hierarchy and rigid structure. The creativity and freedom that had defined Marcus's cooking seemed to be stripped away in favor of cold precision. It didn't take long for the cracks to begin showing. Antonio started questioning Marcus's decisions, dismissing his suggestions, and publicly criticizing his cooking methods. The tension between them grew more palpable with each passing day. The other staff members, too, began to feel the strain. The kitchen, once a tight-knit team, started to splinter under Antonio's oppressive leadership. Then, on a particularly grueling Friday evening, everything came to a head. The dinner service was in full swing, the dining room packed with well-dressed patrons eagerly awaiting their meals. Marcus was manning the sauté station, his focus unwavering as he plated a delicate dish of pan-seared scallops with a truffle butter sauce. His eyes flicked briefly to Antonio, who stood in the corner of the kitchen, arms crossed, watching his every move. Without warning, Antonio stormed over to Marcus's station. "You're not doing it right," Antonio snapped, his voice cutting through the din of the kitchen. "This dish is supposed to be perfect, and you're making it look sloppy." Marcus looked up, taken aback by the sudden criticism. He had spent years perfecting this dish. He knew every detail, every flavor. But Antonio wasn't interested in listening. He grabbed the plate from Marcus's hands and scrutinized it, his eyes narrowed in disdain. "This is unacceptable," Antonio continued, his voice rising. "I need you to step up your game or leave." The entire kitchen fell silent. Marcus felt the sting of Antonio's words, a sharp reminder that despite his years of service, he was nothing more than another cog in the machine. But Marcus didn't respond. He knew better than to engage in a public confrontation, especially when tempers were running high. Instead, he calmly gathered his things, intending to finish his shift and leave as soon as possible. But as the night wore on, things only escalated. Antonio's tirade continued, the pressure mounting on every member of the team. His temper was short, his demands impossible to meet. The kitchen was on edge, the rhythm of the service disrupted by Antonio's relentless criticism. Finally, just as the last table was served, Marcus approached Antonio. His heart was heavy, but he had made up his mind. It was time to leave. "Antonio," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "I've been here for a long time, and I've never seen the kitchen like this. I can't work under these conditions." Antonio looked at him, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "Then leave. We don't need your kind here." Those words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. My kind. The implication was clear. It wasn't just about his cooking. It was about who he was, where he came from, and how he didn't fit into Antonio's narrow vision of what the kitchen should be. With a heavy heart, Marcus turned and walked out of the kitchen for the last time, leaving behind the place he had given so much of himself to. As he stepped into the cool night air, he didn't know what the future held, but he knew that something inside him had shifted. The injustice he had faced would not define him. Instead, it would fuel his journey forward. 6 months later, Marcus would return to El Grand Epicurean, not as the forgotten chef, but as someone who had rediscovered his purpose. And when he did, the kitchen would never be the same again. A new beginning. The days after Marcus left El Grand Epicurean were some of the hardest he had ever faced. It wasn't just the loss of his job, nor the abrupt and unjust way he had been fired by Antonio, that hurt the most. It was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. The kitchen had been his life, a place where he had invested not just his time, but his heart. It was where he had honed his skills, pushed his limits, and earned the respect of countless colleagues and customers. To walk away from that was a gut-wrenching decision, but Marcus knew he had no choice. For a while, he went into a period of reflection. He spent hours walking through the city, lost in thought, trying to understand what had happened. There were moments when he questioned himself. Had he really done something wrong? Had he let his guard down, become complacent? But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been the victim of someone else's arrogance. Antonio had come in with his own agenda, and Marcus had become collateral damage in his ruthless rise to the top. Despite the sting of rejection, Marcus refused to let the bitterness consume him. He had been knocked down, yes, but he wasn't broken. His passion for food, for the artistry of cooking, still burned bright inside him. It was the only thing that had ever given him peace. In those first weeks after leaving El Grand Epicurean, Marcus spent hours experimenting in his small kitchen at home. He revisited old recipes, tried new techniques, and pushed the boundaries of his culinary imagination. Cooking became his therapy, an outlet for the frustration, but also a way to reconnect with his true self. In the midst of this personal rediscovery, Marcus received an unexpected invitation. It came in the form of an email from a former colleague, Lena, who had worked as a sous chef at El Grand Epicurean for several years. Lena was one of the few people who had supported Marcus throughout his tenure at the restaurant. She had always appreciated his steady leadership, his commitment to quality, and the way he treated everyone in the kitchen with respect. "I don't know if you've heard," Lena's email began, "but things are different here now. Antonio's running the show, and it's not what you think. It's not the kitchen you left behind. People are unhappy, morale is low, and the food, it's just not the same. I'm reaching out because I think you should come back. Not for Antonio, but for the place, for the legacy we built. Things have gone downhill, Marcus. We need you." Marcus sat silently for a moment, the words on the screen lingering in front of him. He had spent the last 6 months healing, finding his way back to the joy of cooking on his own terms, and now Lena was offering him a chance to return to the place he had once called home. His mind raced as he thought of the possibilities. Could he go back? Could he face Antonio, the man who had wronged him so deeply? For the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself to dream again. The idea of returning to El Grand Epicurean wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about restoring the kitchen to its former glory, about bringing back the soul of the restaurant that had been lost under Antonio's leadership. It was about showing everyone, especially Antonio, that Marcus Hayes was more than just a chef. He was a force in the culinary world, one who wouldn't be silenced or overlooked. After days of contemplation, Marcus made his decision. He would return, but on his own terms. He would not let himself be controlled by the whims of a power-hungry chef. He would be the change that the restaurant needed. And more importantly, he would prove to himself that no one could take away the passion he had for cooking. The following week, Marcus arrived at El Grand Epicurean. But this time, the scene before him felt different. The exterior of the restaurant looked the same, gleaming glass windows, the brass door handles polished to a perfect shine. But the energy inside was a far cry from the vibrant atmosphere he had once known. The kitchen, which had always been a place of hustle and creativity, now seemed stifled. The staff moved with tension, their faces tired, their eyes glazed over. It was clear that Antonio's reign had taken its toll. The place no longer had the electric buzz of excitement. Instead, it was weighed down by a cloud of discontent. As Marcus walked through the kitchen doors, a hush fell over the room. Some of the staff recognized him immediately, their eyes widening in surprise and relief. Others, less familiar with his face, stared at him with curiosity. But one thing was certain: Marcus Hayes had returned, and it was a moment that no one would forget. Lena, who had been working the line, rushed over to greet him. Her face was lined with stress, but her smile was genuine. "You're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you'd come back." Marcus nodded, his gaze sweeping over the kitchen. "I couldn't stay away forever. But things need to change. This isn't what it used to be." Lena led him to the back office, where Antonio's presence seemed to loom large even though he wasn't there. The walls, once adorned with accolades and photographs of the restaurant's finest moments, now felt sterile and cold. Lena explained that Antonio had become increasingly volatile, pushing out talented chefs and alienating the staff. The dishes that had once earned the restaurant its Michelin stars had started to slip, the creativity suffocated by Antonio's obsession with control. "I've tried talking to him," Lena said, her voice low. "But he's not listening. He's got his own vision now, and it doesn't include anyone else." Marcus felt the weight of the situation. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that something had to be done. "I didn't come back to fight him. I came back to bring the soul of this kitchen back. If we can get the team together, we can turn this place around." With that, Marcus began to slowly reintroduce the techniques and dishes that had made El Grand Epicurean famous. He spent hours in the kitchen, working side by side with the staff, showing them how to break free from the constraints Antonio had placed on them. The dishes, once again, started to take shape. The aromas of Marcus's cooking filled the air, infusing the kitchen with the same energy it had once had. The staff, inspired by Marcus's quiet determination, began to find their rhythm once again. But Marcus knew that the real challenge was yet to come. Antonio had to be dealt with. The time was coming when Marcus would have to confront him, not just for the sake of the restaurant, but for his own sense of justice. And when that day came, it would be a confrontation that no one would forget. The reckoning. As Marcus settled back into the rhythm of the kitchen, he could feel the transformation taking place, not just within the team but within himself as well. It had only been a few days since his return, yet the change was already palpable. The tension that had once gripped El Grand Epicurean began to loosen, like a vice finally releasing its hold. The energy in the kitchen felt alive again, buzzing with the same infectious excitement that had once made it a beacon of culinary brilliance. Marcus had always been a leader by example, never one to demand respect or recognition, but to earn it through his unwavering commitment to his craft. He wasn't the loudest voice in the kitchen. His strength came from his quiet resolve and his ability to teach those around him without ego. Slowly, he began to build back the trust of the team, one meal at a time. The sous chefs, line cooks, and pastry chefs, who had once been weary and disillusioned, started to come alive again under Marcus's guidance. They saw that he wasn't just trying to reclaim the spotlight for himself. He was there to restore the heart of the restaurant. Lena, who had been a loyal ally from the beginning, became Marcus's right hand, working alongside him to make sure that each dish was executed flawlessly. They revisited old recipes, fine-tuning them and adding new touches, but the essence of what had made El Grand Epicurean famous remained. The restaurant's regulars began to notice the shift. Their plates were once again filled with the inventive, flavorful creations that had made El Grand a destination for food lovers. Word of mouth spread quickly, and reservations started filling up faster than ever before. The Michelin inspectors, who had been less frequent in their visits due to the decline in quality, returned, and it was clear that things were looking up. Yet Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. The challenges he faced weren't just confined to the kitchen. Antonio was still in charge, and while he had become a shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced by something darker and more desperate. He was still holding the reins of the restaurant. Marcus had no illusions about the reality of the situation. The changes in the kitchen would be meaningless if Antonio wasn't dealt with, and Marcus was determined to do it on his own terms. One evening, after a particularly successful dinner service, Marcus found himself standing at the back of the restaurant, staring out over the city through the large glass windows. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, a beautiful contrast to the chaos of the kitchen. It was a moment of calm, but Marcus knew it was fleeting. He was preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Antonio, a moment that had been building ever since his return. Lena came up behind him, her voice soft. "You're doing it, Marcus. This place, it's coming back to life." Marcus turned to face her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We're just getting started, but we can't keep doing this under Antonio's thumb. We have to make him see that he's not in control anymore." Lena nodded, her face a mixture of concern and hope. "I know. I don't want you to have to go through this, but we all know it's coming. Antonio's not the same person he was when he first got here. He's losing control. He doesn't know what to do with all the success you're bringing back." Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes focused on something far beyond the city skyline. "It's not just the success. It's the soul of the place. He's lost that, and he doesn't even realize it. He's too focused on being the boss, too consumed with his own vision to see the bigger picture. And that's why I have to confront him." The conversation lingered in the air, both of them aware of the storm that was brewing. It wasn't a matter of if Marcus and Antonio would clash. It was a matter of when. The tension between them was inevitable, and Marcus was ready. He had waited 6 months for this moment, to reclaim what was rightfully his, to prove that his talent was not something that could be discarded or overlooked. The following evening, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual crowd, Marcus received a message from Antonio. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk. In my office. Now." Marcus felt a flicker of unease, but it quickly gave way to a calm resolve. He was ready. As Marcus made his way to Antonio's office, the path felt eerily familiar, like a journey he had taken countless times before. But now, the stakes were different. The power dynamics had shifted. He wasn't the nervous, eager young chef who had been pushed aside all those months ago. He had grown, not just as a chef, but as a person. And this time, he would not allow himself to be silenced. Antonio's office, once a place of self-assured authority, now felt cold and uncomfortable. The walls, adorned with pictures of Michelin awards and glowing reviews, seemed to mock the empty promises that Antonio had made when he first arrived. Antonio himself sat behind the desk, his posture stiff, his face set in a grim expression. "You wanted to see me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though he could feel the adrenaline beginning to build in his chest. Antonio didn't respond immediately. He just studied Marcus for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read him, to find any sign of weakness. But there was none. Marcus had come to this meeting prepared to finally confront the man who had nearly destroyed his career and the place he loved. "I've been watching what's been happening in the kitchen," Antonio said, his voice clipped. "You think you've turned things around, but you're not in charge here anymore. You're playing with fire, Marcus. This place has my vision now, and it's time for you to fall in line." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Antonio's words. But instead of backing down, he stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Your vision," Marcus repeated, his voice low and calm. "This place doesn't need another vision. It needs its soul back. When you came here, you didn't respect what was already in place. You didn't respect the team. And you certainly didn't respect me. You thought you could push me out, but you're the one who's been lost in the process." Antonio's eyes flickered with something darker, anger, perhaps, or fear. "You're out of your depth, Marcus. You're nothing but a has-been." At that, something inside Marcus snapped. "You're wrong," he said, his voice rising, not with anger but with an undeniable certainty. "You might have the title, Antonio, but you don't have the heart. And that's why you'll never understand what it takes to make a restaurant like this great." The tension in the room was thick, like the air before a storm. Antonio opened his mouth, but for the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. Marcus stood tall, his resolve unwavering. "You can't control everything, Antonio," Marcus continued. "You can push people around, bully them into doing things your way. But the soul of this place is bigger than you. I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here to save this kitchen. And if you don't see that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus didn't know what would happen next, but he wasn't afraid. He had come back not to fight for a position, but to fight for what was right, what was just. And he knew that this moment, this reckoning, was the turning point that would shape the future of El Grand Epicurean forever. The battle for the soul. The silence that followed Marcus's words was thick, almost suffocating. Antonio sat at his desk, his fingers tapping slowly on the polished wood, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. Marcus stood in the center of the room, his presence commanding and unwavering, a quiet strength emanating from every fiber of his being. There was no anger in his voice, no need to raise it. He had already said what needed to be said. The ball was now in Antonio's court. Antonio's eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions, none of which were kind. For a moment, it seemed as if he might explode, his ego too bruised to allow any sort of reasonable conversation. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers still tapping against the desk, as though he were weighing the situation. "You think you can just waltz back in here and take over?" Antonio finally said, his voice cold. "I'm the head chef. This restaurant is mine to run. You don't get to come in and lecture me about soul. You've been gone for months, Marcus. What do you think you can do now? This is my restaurant, and no one gets to change that." Marcus felt the heat of Antonio's words, but they didn't faze him. He had already endured the worst of what the new regime had to offer. Now, standing in front of Antonio, he felt nothing but clarity and resolve. This wasn't just about a kitchen or a job anymore. It was about reclaiming something deeper, something much more significant. It was about dignity. "I'm not trying to take over," Marcus said quietly but firmly. "I never left because I wanted to leave. I left because you didn't give me a choice. You wanted to crush the heart of this place, and I couldn't let you do that. I'm here because the kitchen needs its soul back, and because you've lost it. You've lost touch with the very essence of what makes El Grand Epicurean great. Antonio's fingers stopped tapping. The words hung in the air, a challenge he couldn't ignore. But he didn't take the bait immediately. Instead, he just stared at Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if Marcus was serious, or if this was just some passing phase. Then he straightened up in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You're not welcome here," Antonio said, his voice suddenly sharper, a flicker of threat in his tone. "You don't understand how things work now. This is a business, Marcus. It's not about soul or passion. It's about control. I have it, and you don't. So I suggest you pack up and leave before I make this even more difficult for you." The words were venomous, a power play meant to intimidate, to assert dominance. But Marcus wasn't afraid. In that moment, he realized something profound. Antonio's vision had never been about the restaurant. It had always been about himself, about winning, about proving he was the one in charge. But the essence of cooking, the real magic of food, had always been about more than that. It was about connection, about authenticity, and about respect. "I'm not going anywhere," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "You've had your chance, Antonio. You've had your time. But this restaurant, it's bigger than you. It's bigger than both of us. I'm here to make sure it survives, not just as a business, but as the place it was always meant to be. If you can't see that, then it's time for you to step aside." The tension in the room escalated, the air crackling with the weight of the confrontation. Antonio stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He was towering over Marcus now, his eyes burning with barely contained fury. It was clear that his ego had taken a massive hit, and he wasn't prepared to let that go without a fight. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" Antonio sneered, stepping closer to Marcus. "You're delusional. You think people will care about your soul nonsense. No one cares about that. They care about results. They care about success. I'm the one who brought this place back from the brink. Without me, El Grand Epicurean would still be just another tired restaurant. So don't tell me what this place needs." Marcus stood firm, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked with Antonio's. "You didn't bring this place back. You broke it. You suffocated the creativity, the heart of the kitchen. This restaurant was built on passion, on collaboration, on the belief that food is more than just fuel. It's an experience. But you've lost sight of that. And now you're trying to destroy everything it stands for." Antonio scoffed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. He took a step back, as if considering Marcus's words for the first time, and then he let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and fix everything? You're wrong. You'll never be the chef you once were, Marcus. You've lost your edge. You're just an old man trying to relive his glory days." The insult stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard worse in his time, had endured much more than petty jabs from a man who didn't understand the first thing about him. What mattered wasn't Antonio's insults. It was the legacy of the restaurant, the people in the kitchen who had been made to feel small, the trust that had been broken. "I'm not trying to relive anything," Marcus replied, his voice low but powerful. "I'm here to restore what's been lost, to rebuild what you've torn apart. And if you're too blinded by your own arrogance to see that, then maybe it's time for you to move on. Because this place will outlast you. It always has. And it always will." Antonio's face reddened with rage, but there was something in his expression that shifted. A hesitation, a crack in his veneer of invincibility. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Marcus could feel it. Antonio was realizing that he had no hold over him anymore. His power, his influence, was evaporating before his eyes. But Antonio wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. His eyes darkened, and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "Fine," Antonio said, his voice dripping with malice. "You want it. You got it. But don't think for a second that you can walk in here and just take everything back. I'm still the head chef, and I won't let you destroy what I've built. This is my kitchen, Marcus, and I will fight you for it." Marcus nodded, his expression unshaken. "Then fight me. But remember, Antonio, you're not fighting me. You're fighting everything this restaurant stands for, and I'm not backing down." With that, Marcus turned and walked toward the door, his back straight, his heart steady. The battle was far from over. But he knew something Antonio didn't. The real strength of a kitchen didn't come from power. It came from the soul. And Marcus Hayes wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him. Not now. Not ever. As he stepped back into the kitchen, the staff looked up at him, their faces filled with both anticipation and uncertainty. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He walked to the center of the kitchen, where the heart of El Grand Epicurean had always been. And for the first time in months, the kitchen came alive once again. It was only a matter of time before the battle for the soul of El Grand Epicurean would come to a head. But Marcus knew that whatever happened, the fight was worth it. The restaurant, the team, and the passion that had built it would survive. And when the dust settled, it would be his legacy, and not Antonio's, that would define El Grand Epicurean for years to come. The turning point. The days following the confrontation were filled with a quiet, almost oppressive tension. Marcus's challenge had been issued, and now it was a waiting game. The kitchen, once again, hummed with its usual energy, but beneath it lay a subtle undercurrent of uncertainty. The staff was watching, waiting to see how the standoff between Marcus and Antonio would unfold. Some had been loyal to Marcus from the beginning, while others who had been swayed by Antonio's brash promises remained uncertain. As for Marcus, he didn't allow the tension to distract him. If anything, it gave him more resolve. The kitchen was his sanctuary, the one place where he knew he could make a difference. So he focused on what he did best: cooking. Each dish was an act of defiance, a statement of what El Grand Epicurean could be, a place where creativity and passion were not just buzzwords, but the very foundation of everything. But the confrontation with Antonio was far from over. Antonio had retreated to his office after their exchange, his pride wounded, but not broken. The restaurant, to him, was still his empire, and he was determined to maintain control, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. Marcus knew this, and he prepared himself for the next move in the battle. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. It was late one evening, after service had ended and the staff had begun to filter out, when Marcus received a call from Lena. Her voice was urgent, tinged with a hint of fear. "Marcus, you need to come to the office. Now." There was no mistaking the seriousness in her tone. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his coat and made his way to the back of the restaurant, his mind racing. Had Antonio decided to make a public move? Was he going to try to fire Marcus or undermine his authority in some other way? Marcus knew that Antonio wouldn't let go easily, but he had no idea how far the other man might be willing to go. As Marcus entered Antonio's office, the scene that unfolded before him left him momentarily speechless. Lena was standing by the desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, while Antonio stood at the other end of the room, his back to them, staring out the window. There was a silence between them, heavy and thick, as if some unseen force was at play. Antonio didn't turn around when Marcus entered. Instead, he spoke in a low, controlled voice. "You really think you can just waltz back into my kitchen and take over, don't you? I told you, I will not let you ruin this restaurant." Marcus's gut tightened. There was something different in Antonio's voice now. Something desperate, as if he knew his control was slipping away. "What's going on, Antonio?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but resolute. He wasn't about to back down, but he needed to understand where Antonio's head was. "What do you want from me?" "I told you what I want. I just want this kitchen to be what it once was." Antonio finally turned to face Marcus, his eyes cold but with an undercurrent of something darker. "You think I'm just going to hand over the reins to you? That's not how this works. I built this restaurant from the ground up. It was me, Marcus. I brought this place back. Not you. You're too sentimental. You think the way things were before can just magically return. Marcus took a step forward, his expression unshaken. You didn't bring it back. You took away everything that made it great. The soul, the creativity, the trust, the things that mattered to the people who made this place work, day in and day out. Antonio's nostrils flared, and for a brief moment, his facade cracked. His face reddened, and his fists clenched. It was clear that Marcus's words had hit a nerve, but instead of responding with logic or reason, Antonio seemed to react with pure emotion. I am the one in charge here, Antonio snapped. I have the power. I have the connections. I have everything you need to succeed. You're nothing without me. I built this place. You. He paused, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. You're just a chef, Marcus. A cook. You have no idea what it takes to make a restaurant thrive. Marcus could feel the anger rising in Antonio's words, but he didn't flinch. This was exactly what he had expected. Antonio wasn't fighting for the restaurant anymore. He was fighting for his own ego, his own sense of control. You're wrong, Marcus said softly. It's not about power or control. It's about trust. It's about believing in the team, in the food, in the vision. I'm not here to take over your restaurant, Antonio. I'm here to bring it back to life. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to let go. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Antonio opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was stunned, and in that silence, Marcus saw it. Antonio's vulnerability, his realization that the game he had been playing was over. It wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. The very thing he had destroyed, the soul of the kitchen, was what had given a grand Epicurean its life. And now, Marcus was the one who had control of that. But Antonio wasn't ready to give up just yet. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked as though he might lash out in some way. You think you're better than me, don't you? Antonio said, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He knew the truth. No, he said finally, his voice calm but firm. I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm better for this place. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for us to go our separate ways. The words hit Antonio harder than Marcus could have anticipated. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been defeated, his ego battered, his authority slipping away. It wasn't just that Marcus was standing up to him. It was that Marcus had something Antonio didn't. He had the respect of the staff, the trust of the team, and the loyalty of those who had always believed in him. Lena, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. Antonio, it's over. We've all seen it. We've seen the change in the kitchen, the energy you can't force, and the respect Marcus commands. This isn't just about us versus you. It's about what's best for this restaurant. And right now, Marcus is the one who knows how to lead. Antonio's face twisted, but there was no denying it. The shift had already begun. The staff had begun to rally behind Marcus, and the restaurant's patrons were responding to the renewed energy. Antonio's position as head chef was no longer a given. It was being questioned at every turn. Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. I'm not here to fight you, Antonio. I'm here to rebuild. But if you're not willing to step aside, then I'll do what I have to do. For the good of this place. The silence stretched out between them, and for the first time, it was clear that Antonio didn't have the answers. He had played his hand, but he had nothing left. Finally, Antonio turned, his shoulders sagging, his face pale with the weight of his defeat. Fine, he said, the words leaving his mouth bitter and grudging. You win, but don't think for a second, this is over, Marcus. But Marcus knew better. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. And while Antonio had conceded for now, the true fight was just beginning. The fight for the heart and soul of a grand Epicurean, As Marcus walked out of the office, he felt a sense of calm. He had won the first round, but the work wasn't finished. He was ready for whatever came next, because in the end, it wasn't just about saving the restaurant. It was about restoring the passion and purpose that had always been its beating heart. The soul restored. In the weeks that followed Antonio's reluctant departure, the transformation of El Grand Epicurean was nothing short of miraculous. What had once been a place where ambition and ego ruled now hummed with a different energy, a sense of hope and possibility. The staff, who had been tense and divided under Antonio's reign, found themselves reinvigorated by Marcus's quiet, steadfast leadership. The kitchen no longer felt like a battlefield. Instead, it was a sanctuary of creativity and collaboration. Marcus had always known that a kitchen was more than just the sum of its parts. It wasn't just about the ingredients, the recipes, or the techniques. It was about the people. It was about respect, mutual trust, and shared vision. And slowly, the staff began to see what he had always seen. The true potential of El Grand Epicurean wasn't in the cold efficiency of the kitchen's operations. It was in the heart of the people who worked there, who bled for their craft. The first signs of the restaurant's revival were small but significant. The staff began working in harmony again, their movements fluid and synchronized, as if they were an orchestra and the kitchen was their stage. The dishes started to sing with new vibrancy, as Marcus encouraged his team to bring their own personal touches to each plate. Under Antonio's rule, the food had been sterile, clinical even, each dish executed with precision, but lacking the soul that had once made El Grand Epicurean unique. Now, under Marcus's guidance, the food had returned to its roots, infused with the passion and individuality of the chefs who created it. But it wasn't just the food that was changing. It was the entire atmosphere. The dining room, once cold and overly formal, began to embrace the warmth of the kitchen spirit. The front-of-house staff, led by Lena, who had been a staunch ally of Marcus from the beginning, started to infuse their service with genuine hospitality, reflecting the new energy in the kitchen. Guests noticed the difference immediately. The reviews that had once been lukewarm were now glowing, and reservations began to fill up weeks in advance. But Marcus knew that restoring the soul of the restaurant was a delicate balancing act. It wasn't enough to simply bring back the old atmosphere. He had to prove that the restaurant could thrive in this new chapter, that it wasn't just a flash in the pan, but a rebirth. It wasn't just about getting the dishes right or creating a buzz. It was about creating a sustainable culture of excellence that could endure. It was one late afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set and the kitchen was preparing for the dinner rush, that Marcus found himself standing before the stove, his hands working through the motions, his mind distant. He had been thinking a lot about what was next, about how to ensure the changes that had been made weren't temporary, how to build something that would last. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind him. Lena stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with something akin to pride. "You've done it, Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her words. "You've brought it back." Marcus paused, wiping his hands on his apron, and turned to face her. There was a soft smile on his lips, but behind it was a quiet understanding. He knew what she meant. They both knew. The restaurant was back. It wasn't just the food or the service. It was the energy, the soul of El Grand Epicurean, that had returned. It had taken a while, but the kitchen was finally humming again. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But this isn't just me, Lena. It's all of us. We've done this together." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the kitchen, where the staff moved with purpose and confidence. "You've given them hope, Marcus. You've given us all hope." As Marcus looked around, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. The journey had been hard, filled with setbacks, betrayals, and moments of doubt. But as he watched his team work, as he tasted the dishes they produced, he knew it had been worth it. Every single step. The turning point had come when he realized that it wasn't just about reclaiming the restaurant from Antonio. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been lost, about reminding the staff of the values that had made Le Grand Epicurean great in the first place. They had all worked so hard, so passionately, to create something that was more than just a meal. They had worked to create an experience, a memory. In the weeks following Antonio's departure, Marcus and Lena had made a point to sit down with each member of the staff, listening to their concerns, hearing their ideas, and creating a space where everyone felt they could contribute. Slowly, trust began to rebuild itself. The divide that had been sown under Antonio's rule started to dissolve. The kitchen became a place of camaraderie, not competition. But despite the progress, Marcus knew there was still work to be done. The true test was going to come when they faced external challenges. The restaurant world was unpredictable, and success in the industry was never guaranteed. They would have to keep evolving, keep pushing themselves, and keep staying true to the values that had brought them back from the brink. That test came sooner than expected. One evening, just as the kitchen was getting ready for its usual dinner rush, an email came through. An invitation to a prestigious food critics' private tasting event. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything for Le Grand Epicurean. A glowing review from this critic could propel the restaurant to international fame. It was the kind of recognition that chefs dreamed of, but rarely achieved. The problem was, Marcus knew that the food they were about to serve that night wasn't their best. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't what they were capable of. Lena had come into the kitchen, her face tense. "Marcus, the critic's coming tonight. Are we ready?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. Marcus took a deep breath. It was a challenge. It was their moment, but it was also the moment when everything could fall apart if they weren't careful. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of determination. "We have to be." The dinner service that night was intense, each dish scrutinized under the unforgiving gaze of the critic, who sat at a table in the corner, taking notes after every course. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, every chef on edge, every plate prepared with an almost palpable sense of urgency. Marcus moved through the kitchen with a steady focus, guiding his team, offering encouragement, reminding them of what they were capable of. By the time the last dish was sent out, the kitchen had become a symphony of purpose, each element falling into place. The critic had tasted every dish, asked questions, and scrutinized the flavors with the precision of someone who had tasted it all. But as the last plate was sent out, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake. Hours later, as the last plates were cleared away and the restaurant began to empty, Marcus stood in the middle of the kitchen, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the entire team had given their all. They had poured everything they had into making that night perfect. The email came in the early morning hours. Marcus opened it with trembling hands, unsure of what he would read. But as his eyes scanned the words, his heart swelled with relief and pride. The critic had written a glowing review, praising the food, the atmosphere, and most importantly, the soul that had returned to Le Grand Epicurean. The review was everything they had hoped for and more. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. It had worked. Against all odds, they had done it. They had restored Le Grand Epicurean to its rightful place, and they had done it by staying true to the very values that had once made it great. The soul of the restaurant had been restored, not through flashy techniques or trendy dishes, but through something deeper, the commitment to creating food that mattered, food that connected with people on a personal level. And in that moment, Marcus knew that this wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of something even greater. The legacy. Months passed, and the reputation of Le Grand Epicurean grew. The glowing review from the prestigious critic had sparked a wave of attention, with food lovers from all over the world seeking a seat at Marcus's table. Reservations were now booked weeks in advance, and the kitchen was working at full capacity, serving not just delicious food, but an experience that left diners in awe. The restaurant had transcended its previous identity, becoming a beacon of culinary excellence, but with a humility that had long been lost in its early days. For Marcus, though, success was never just about recognition or fame. It had never been about the accolades or the crowded dining rooms. What mattered most was what the restaurant represented, the soul of it, the beating heart that brought together people who shared a common passion for food, creativity, and authenticity. Even with all the attention, Marcus remained focused on his team, continually reminding them that the essence of the restaurant could never be lost. The soul of Le Grand Epicurean was not simply in its food, but in the people who made it. From the front-of-house staff to the dishwashers, every individual had a role in weaving together the fabric of the restaurant's identity. Marcus knew that the restaurant's success was not just about how well the dishes were executed. It was about the culture, the atmosphere, and the integrity that infused everything they did. But there was one challenge that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The success of the restaurant was drawing attention, not just from food critics and enthusiasts, but from investors, partners, and restaurateurs who saw the opportunity to turn Le Grand Epicurean into something even bigger. Some approached him with offers to expand, to franchise, to open new locations in different cities, or even abroad. They saw the potential to turn the restaurant into a brand, to capitalize on its newfound fame. For Marcus, it was an intoxicating offer. The prospect of expanding Le Grand Epicurean beyond its walls, of sharing his vision with a wider audience, was a tempting idea. But deep down, he knew something that made him hesitate. He wasn't interested in becoming a business mogul or turning his restaurant into a global chain. To him, the soul of Le Grand Epicurean was too precious, too fragile to risk diluting it for profit. He spent many sleepless nights grappling with the decision, torn between the possibility of growing his brand and the fear that it would compromise everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. One evening, while walking through the bustling kitchen, watching his team prepare for service, Marcus found clarity. He realized that he had already built something far more valuable than just a successful restaurant. He had built a legacy, a place that valued people, creativity, and authenticity over fame and fortune. And that legacy, he knew, could not be compromised. The decision was made. Marcus chose to turn down the offers and to continue focusing on what mattered most: the food, the team, and the community they had created. He wanted to remain a chef, not a businessman. His purpose was clear: to preserve the integrity of Le Grand Epicurean, to cultivate a space where creativity thrived, and where the kitchen would always be a sanctuary for those who shared his passion for food. But even with this clarity, there were still challenges ahead. As the restaurant continued to gain more recognition, Marcus found that the spotlight was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The pressure to keep up with the ever-changing trends in the culinary world, the constant demand for innovation, and the increasing expectations of both critics and customers all began to weigh on him. One evening, as the kitchen prepared for a particularly busy service, Marcus pulled Lena aside. She could tell from the wariness in his eyes that he had been struggling. "Lena," he began, his voice tired but resolute, "I've been thinking about something. We've come so far, but I'm starting to feel like I'm losing my way. There's this constant pressure to be the best, to stay ahead of everyone else. It's like I'm chasing something that I can never quite catch." Lena listened carefully, her expression softening as she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Marcus, you've already done it. You've brought this place back to life. You've done the hard work. And the rest, well, it's just noise. Don't let it distract you. We're here because we believe in what you've created. It's not about keeping up with anyone else. It's about staying true to who we are." Her words settled in his heart, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of peace. Lena was right. The restaurant wasn't about being the best in the world. It was about being the best for the people who mattered most: his team, his customers, and himself. It was about authenticity, and that was something no one could take from him. With that realization, Marcus made a vow to himself and to his team. He would never lose sight of what mattered. He would continue to evolve, yes, but always with the foundation of truth, creativity, and collaboration that had brought El Grand Epicurean back from the brink. In the months that followed, Marcus became more intentional with his time. He spent less time worrying about external pressures and more time focusing on the people around him. The chefs who worked tirelessly in the kitchen, the front-of-house staff who greeted guests with warmth and hospitality, and the suppliers who brought the best ingredients to the table. He made it a priority to mentor the younger chefs in the kitchen, to help them find their own voices and embrace their own creativity. He encouraged them to experiment, to take risks, and to never be afraid of failure, knowing that every mistake was a lesson learned. As the years went by, Marcus's influence as a chef and leader grew. But his success wasn't measured by how many restaurants he could open or how many Michelin stars he could accumulate. It was measured by the way he touched the lives of the people around him. His legacy was one of integrity, humility, and passion for the craft. It wasn't long before El Grand Epicurean became more than just a restaurant. It became a community, a place where food was not just a commodity, but an experience, a shared journey between the kitchen and the dining room. It was a place where people could come together, not just to eat, but to connect, to celebrate, and to be reminded of the beauty of life's simplest pleasures. The legacy of Marcus Hayes, the once dismissed chef who had been fired unjustly, was now secure. El Grand Epicurean was thriving, not because it had become a trend, but because it had remained true to itself. And as Marcus stood in the kitchen, watching his team work together with precision and care, he knew that the soul of the restaurant had been restored, and that it would live on long after him. His journey had come full circle. What had started as a battle for survival had transformed into a celebration of resilience, creativity, and community. And in the end, that was the true measure of success. El Grand Epicurean had not just survived, it had become a testament to the power of passion, perseverance, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to dream. And Marcus, the chef who had once been cast aside, stood at the center of it all, knowing that the legacy he had built was one that would inspire generations to come.